The young and the restless, Matt's long-bruited comeback didn't just rattle the Newman family, it exploded everything they allowed they could control. What began as a calculated plan for vengeance entwined into a chain response of fear, despair, and unrecoverable consequences. For months, Matt had dallied like a ghost on the outskirts of Genoa City, his name spoken in lowered voices, his shadow stretching over every uneasy family regale and every tense boardroom meeting. The Newmans believed they could outthink him the way they always outthink their adversaries, with strategy, influence, and an unshakable belief that blood fidelity makes them untouchable. But this time, vengeance wasn't clean. It wasn't contained. And it clearly didn't go according to plan. The trouble started still, as it frequently does. Nick had been the first to smell Matt's presence, ending in calls that dropped into silence. Buses moping too long at the check. Tales from connections who refused to say important but said enough. Nick's instinct has always been to cover first and ask questions latterly, and this situation was no exception. But what made this different was the stewing wrathfulness beneath his resoluteness. Matt had hurt people Nick loved. He'd destabilized Sienna's family. He'd left emotional wreckage that still hadn't been cleared. Nick induced himself that defying Matt wasn't just necessary, it was righteous. Victor, ever the mastermind of strategy, didn't incontinently object. In fact, he encouraged a more measured form of retribution. The primogenitor of the Newman dynasty has erected his conglomerate on the principle that power is stylish exercise designedly. He advised Nick that revenge taken in haste could fracture further than it repairs. Yet indeed Victor undervalued how particular this had come for his son. The lines between business contest and family vendetta blurred until they were indistinguishable. Victoria watched the escalation with mounting dread. She could see it in Nick's eyes, the same fire that had burned in their fathers for decades. Preoccupation disguised as duty. Protection cloaking pride. She contended with him to decelerate down, to consider the collateral damage. But Nick, formerly stretched thin and decreasingly dependent on anodynes to manage a moping injury, brushed off her enterprises. He claimed he'd everything under control. In Genoa City, those words are frequently the first sign that nothing is. Meanwhile, Matt made his reentry with calculated perfection. He didn't storm into city with pitfalls. He reappeared at events. He shook hands. He smiled. He reminded everyone that he could play the long game too. The most unsettling part wasn't his aggression, it was his calm. Matt knew the Newmans would reply. He counted on it. Every subtle provocation was bait. The tilting point came at what should have been an ordinary gathering at the Newman estate. Family members assembled under the guise of consanity, determined to finalize a plan to rein Matt financially and fairly. Victor outlined a strategy to indurate means and insulate him from abettors. Victoria prepared attestation. Nick donated to handle the direct battle. It was supposed to be clean, controlled, a show of force. But Matt had formally anticipated their moves. When Nick tracked Matt down at an abandoned property outside city, a position fed to him through a source he believed was secure, he walked into a trap designed not to kill him, but to provoke him. The battle that followed was raw, fueled by months of pent-up rage. Words escalated into shoves. Shoves into punches. And in one disastrous moment, armament entered the equation. It wasn't premeditated. It wasn't part of the plan. But formally drawn, everything changed. A single projectile shattered the standoff. Silence followed, thick and suffocating. Matt collapsed. Nick stood frozen, the sound of the shot echoing in his mind long after it faded into the night air. Whether the detector pull was purposeful or accidental came inapplicable in that moment. Blood strained into the dirt. Vengeance had crossed into commodity endless. When Victor arrived, advised by a shamus he'd intimately placed on Nick's auto, he incontinently shifted into damage control mode. His first instinct wasn't grief or fear. It was constraint. He assessed the scene with cold effectiveness, calculating legal exposure, implicit substantiations, and narrative architecture. Victoria, arriving moments latterly, replied else. Horror registered across her face. This wasn't a commercial battle. This was a life. The question of whether Matt survived dallied in agonizing query. Paramedics were called anonymously. Stories were constructed before the enchantresses indeed faded. but the cerebral impact had formally settled in. The Newmans, so habituated to orchestrating issues, were now replying to bone they couldn't undo. News of the firing spread through Genoa city like campfire. Sharon, formerly anxious about Nick's decreasingly reckless jest, felt her worst fears verified. She knew the cost of vendettas. She had lived through enough cycles of vengeance to fate the pattern. Sienna, whose family had formerly been destabilized by Matt's once conduct, felt an entirely different surge of emotion, complicated grief tangled with relief and guilt. No bone wanted bloodshed. But no one could deny that Matt's presence had brought chaos. As investigators began circling, the family's consanity started to crack. Victoria questioned whether covering up details would only consolidate the damage. Nick oscillated between defiance and quiet shock. Victor remained bent, averring that the family must present a united front. "We handle this," he declared, as if sheer will could bend reality. But cracks widened. Journalists bivouacked outside Newman Enterprises. Rumors of a fatal showdown dominated captions. Share prices wavered as investors tasted insecurity. The vengeance that was supposed to reassert dominance rather exposed vulnerability. For the first time in times, the Newman name wasn't synonymous with power, it was synonymous with reproach. The emotional risk was indeed heavier behind unrestricted doors. Nick replayed the battle in his mind endlessly. Did Matt reach first? Did he misconstrue the trouble? Could he have walked down? The certainty he carried into that battle faded, replaced by mistrustfulness. Victoria, torn between fidelity and morality, plotted to attune her family's defensive instinct with the unrecoverable outgrowth. And Victor, though outwardly smooth, faced the uncomfortable reality that indeed he cannot control every variable. Still, the consequences could be legal, explosive, if Matt survives. However, the weight of that futurity will hang every Newman gathering moving forward. If he doesn't, either outgrowth threatens to collapse the precisely constructed image of invincibility the family has spent decades cultivating. Vengeance, in proposition, restores balance. In practice, it frequently tips the scale further into chaos. The Newmans believed they were ending a trouble. Rather, they may have created a heritage-altering reproach. Alliances within the family strain under differing doctrines. Victor's ruthless pragmatism versus Victoria's conservative ethics versus Nick's emotionally driven protectionism. And beyond the Newman circle, Genoa City watches. Some see justice. Others see arrogance backfiring. Numerous simply see evidence that power doesn't guard anyone from consequence. The tragedy of Matt's comeback isn't just the violence. It's the unraveling of certainty. The Newmans have always thrived on the belief that they can anticipate every move. This time, they misestimated the cost. Blood, non-fictional or emblematic, now stains their hands. And once that line is crossed, stepping back becomes insolvable. As the week closes, the question lingers: was this tone defense, a woeful accident, or the ineluctable result of raising vengeance? The legal system may decide one verity. Public opinion may decide another. But within the Newman family, the deeper reckoning has only begun. Because indeed, if the reproach fades, indeed if the disquisition resolves, indeed if the family closes species and survives the fallout, they will no way again be suitable to say they controlled the outgrowth. This time, vengeance controlled them. The days following the firing didn't bring clarity, they brought pressure. In the young and the restless, fallout is infrequently immediate. It simmers, tightens, and also forces its way to the face when no bone is prepared. The Newman family snappily realized that the fatal showdown with Matt wasn't a single disastrous moment but the morning of a prolonged reckoning that would test their fidelity, their morality, and the veritably foundation of their power. Nick withdrew first. Outwardly, he maintained countenance. He met with attorneys. He stuck to a set statement emphasizing tone defense. He repeated the same measured explanation to Victoria, to Victor, to anyone who dared to question what happened that night. But intimately, he unraveled. The split second before the gun went off replayed endlessly in his mind. He flashed back the look in Matt's eyes, recalcitrant, perhaps indeed triumphant, as if Matt had known pushing Nick to the point was the ultimate palm. Whether Matt survived or not nearly came secondary to the fact that Nick had crossed a line he formerly swore he no way would. Victoria saw it before anyone differently did. The slight earthquake in his hand. The distant regard when exchanges drifted. She brazened him gently at the estate one evening, the weight of the family heritage hanging between them. This isn't just about guarding us, she told him still. This is about what it's doing to you. Nick claimed he was fine, but Victoria honored denial. She had seen their father carry analogous burdens for decades, justified, compartmentalized, but no way truly cancelled. She stressed Nick was stepping onto that same path. Victor, meanwhile, concentrated entirely on constraint. He actuated every legal and political connection he'd cultivated over the times. He framed the narrative as a protective act against a dangerous man who had scarified multiple families. However, Victor intended to ensure his credibility would be destroyed in court. If Matt lived, however, Victor would argue that Nick had no choice, if Matt didn't. To Victor, this wasn't about ethics. It was about survival. But indeed Victor undervalued how fragile perception can be. The media content boosted. Footage of Matt from times past resurfaced. Interviews, charity events, indeed old courtroom appearances. Observers batted whether he was truly the villain the Newmans portrayed or a rival excessively excluded when he came inconvenient. Social media buzzed with enterprise that the important family had eventually gone too far. Investors dithered. Board members rumored. For the first time in a long while, the Newman name felt vulnerable. Sharon's response added another emotional subcast. When she learned the full extent of what happened, her heart broke, not for Matt, but for Nick. She understood the instinct to cover. She understood how sweat can transubstantiate into aggression when someone you love is hovered. But she also knew that revenge infrequently ends fairly. She visited Nick still, without cameras or attorneys present. You don't have to carry this alone, she told him. Nick nearly laughed at the irony. Carrying burdens alone had virtually come a Newman tradition. Still, Sharon's presence softened commodity in him. For a moment, he allowed himself to admit query, not about why he brazened Matt, but about how snappily effects escalated. Away, Sienna plodded with her own equivocal feelings. Matt's return had formally restarted injuries she tried desperately to close. Hearing about the battle left her shaken. She didn't want violence. She didn't want anyone hurt. But she also couldn't ignore the complicated relief that washed over her at the study that Matt might no longer have the power to destabilize her life. Noah came fiercely defensive again, doubling down on his pledge to shield her from farther detriment. But this time, the trouble wasn't Matt, it was the ripple effect of his downfall. However, if testaments dragged old alliances into the light, Sienna's name could resurface in captions she no way asked to make, if examinations uncovered deeper connections. Noah assured her that he'd stand beside her no matter what surfaced. His oath wasn't loud or dramatic. It was steady, determined. Back within the Newman walls, fractures strengthened. Victoria began questioning the decision to approach Matt at all. She wasn't condemning Nick outright, but she couldn't shake the feeling that their family's pattern of preemptive strikes had eventually entwined beyond control. She brazened Victor in his office late one night. Still, the news would come with relief, but also dubitation. If the father was Liam would count backward. He'd flash back the nights they argued, the distance between them, the moments she dithered before kissing him. He'd ask if there was someone differently, and indeed if the child was biologically his, emotionally there would still be a shadow. That shadow had a name: Thomas. Still, the consequences would be explosive, if the father was Thomas. Thomas, who had spent times fighting to prove he'd changed. Thomas, whose love for hope formerly framed on preoccupation but had evolved into commodity steadier, quieter. A child between them wouldn't just be a baby, it would be an endless bond. And Hope knew that revealing that verity would crump like a lemon inside both families. So she awaited. Her body, still, refused to cooperate with her strategy. Morning sickness struck unpredictably. She kept crackers in her bag and peppermint tea in her office. During a design meeting, she had to excuse herself suddenly, leaving a room full of directors swapping ganders. Tales began circulating, first about stress, also about illness. No bone. Guest gestation right down, but in Los Angeles society, enterprise spreads faster than fact. Meanwhile, Liam grew decreasingly unsettled. He noticed the emotional wall Hope had erected. When he tried to talk about the future, she diverted the discussion to work or Beth's academy conditioning. He told himself he was being paranoid, that the ghosts of his constant triangle with Steffi were hanging him again. But one night, when he reached for Hope in bed and she gently turned down, commodity inside him cracked. "Are you still in love with me?" he asked still. The question pierced her. She was in love with the idea of stability, with the dream of a united family. But she was also in love with possibility. And possibility was dangerous. Thomas, on the other hand, felt drawn toward her again, nearly magnetically. He'd been careful, giving her space, fastening on Douglas and rebuilding trust with Ridge and Steffi. But there was a wimpiness in Hope's eyes when they worked together, a participated silence that spoke volumes. One autumn, as they reviewed fabric samples alone, their hands brushed. The electricity was inarguable. Hope pulled back snappily, guilt submerging her face. Thomas noticed. "What's going on?" he asked gently. "You're carrying commodity." If only he knew how non-fictional that statement was. Hope's secretiveness wasn't just about avoiding battle, it was about delaying heartache. She knew that once the verity came out, someone would lose. Either Liam would feel betrayed beyond form, or Thomas would feel shut out of a life-changing disclosure. And there was also Steffi to consider. Steffi, who had eventually set up peace with Finn and stability for her children. However, Steffi would fiercely cover her family, but she'd also question Hope's motives. If the baby was Thomas's, old battles would resurface, and Hope would formally again be cast as the busybody. Brooke tasted the storm brewing long before the first lightning strike. Mates always do. She possessed Hope in the design office one evening, her voice calm but establishment. "You're hiding commodity," Brooke said. "And whatever it is, you don't have to face it alone." Hope nearly confessed also. The words quivered on her lips. But she allowed. About how snappily Brooke would condemn Thomas, how she'd march straight to Ridge, kindling another chapter in their endless war. Hope couldn't risk turning her gestation into a battleground. Because that was the core of it. She didn't want her baby to be her armament. As weeks passed, the physical changes came inarguable. Acclimatized jackets were replaced with flowing outlines. At a high-profile fashion exercise, a journalist asked if Hope was debuting a motherliness-inspired line. The question hit like a poke. Cameras zoomed in, empty for evidence. Hope laughed it off gracefully, but inside she shocked. The timepiece was running out. The real fracture came when Douglas innocently placed his hand on Hope's stomach during a family regale and asked if there was a baby in there. Children's smell effects grown-ups tried desperately to hide. The table went silent. Liam sat. Thomas goggled. Hope forced a smile and changed the subject, but the damage was done. Latterly that night, Liam brazened her. "You're pregnant," he said. Not a question. A statement. Gashes welled in her eyes. Silence was no longer an option. But indeed standing at the edge of concession, Hope dithered. Because revealing the gestation meant revealing the timeline. It meant explaining the night everything changed. It meant admitting that her marriage had fractured long before anyone realized. Why did she hide the shocking gestation? Because she demanded space to decide what kind of future she wanted before other people made that decision for her. Because she was tired of being pulled between two men whose history mandated her fortune. Because she wanted one thing in her life to belong solely to her, at least for a little while.